Okay, so we just finished looking at the sort of prefigurative features of feudalism, things like merchant capital and long-distance trade, as well as handcraft production, things that would eventually become much more important as the transition from feudalism to capitalism progressed. So now what we're going to look at is, okay, what actually happened, right? Why did we get a shift from feudalism to capitalism that began in sort of the 14th century? So what we're going to look at here is sort of 4 areas that contributed to this factor. Now, there is disagreement amongst historians over, as I alluded to earlier, what is the prime mover? What is the prime thing that actually caused this shift? For a long time, many historians thought it was an ecological crisis or demographic crisis, which I'll talk about in a minute. Other historians, as I mentioned earlier, people like Rodney Hilton, later historians like Paul Brenner, acting in sort of a Marxian tradition, argue that it was actually class conflict and it was revolts, peasant revolts specifically, that led to sort of the breakdown and crisis of late feudalism that would eventually lead to capitalism. Some historians focus on the rise of towns and cities, sort of things that existed in these sort of prefigurative features of capitalism that was really just about the expansion of towns and cities. And others focus on the expansion of trade, that it's this sort of quantitative expansion that you always had trade, but what happens after sort of the 14th and 15th century was you get this dramatic expansion of trade, and as a result it leads to what eventually becomes capitalism. So it's the question of what is actually the prime mover here. Now we're going to examine all of these things in a bit more detail in a minute. Now again, the historians disagree, so what I want to do is go through each one of them and sort of give you a sense of how it contributed. Because even though historians may disagree on what the prime mover is, all historians agree that these 4 factors were all important in the transition to capitalism. They may disagree on which one was the most important, but all of these things matter. So we'll look at sort of the first one here. So the first one, when I'm talking about ecology and demography, what I'm talking about here is the Black Death, or the bubonic plague of the 14th century. Now, the bubonic plague is probably one of the worst pandemics to ever hit the world, probably dwarfed only by the 1919 pandemic, the Spanish influenza, which is, of course, in the news a lot lately because it's sort of the last mass pandemic before this one. Now, the bubonic plague, of course, was a much, much, much deadlier disease than what's happening right now. The survival rate was very low. As you can see in this slide here, it led to about 50 million deaths in Europe. 60% of Europe's population died in the 14th century as a result of the bubonic plague. If we go to England specifically, in some cases, half the population of London died. And you can imagine how this devastated the countryside as well. Now, where does the Black Death come from? And again, this is why it's important to focus on the interconnectivity of, say, global economic systems and trade routes. So if we look at where the Black Death comes from, we have to look to the spread of the Mongolian Empire in the century previously. So in the 1200s, the Mongolian Empire, as I said earlier, under Chinggis Khan, spreads dramatically and very quickly out from what's referred to as the Eurasian Steppe, which is today Mongolia, and they sort of ride down and conquer most of Central Asia, lots of Russia, China, parts of northern India, but not southern India, parts of the world that borders on what would become the Ottoman Empire, but not all of it. And as a result, even after the Mongolian Empire sort of fragments after the death of Chinggis Khan and sort of goes to all different heirs all over Eurasia, as I said, you get the Great Khanate in China. You also get sort of what's referred to as the Golden Horde Khanate on the Black Sea. It facilitates long-distance trade between East and West, right? Marco Polo being the most famous of them. But what comes with this interconnectivity, of course, like happens in a lot of encounters, as we'll see later, especially between Europeans and indigenous North Americans, is, well, if goods can spread, disease can spread. And so what happens beginning in sort of 1346, as you can see here around the Black Sea, the plague, which originates in Central Asia, basically spreads through the Mongolian trade routes. It eventually gets to China and devastates the population, although not quite to the extent that it does in Europe. And by 1346, it's on the doorstep of Europe. And as you can see how it travels through Europe here in sort of the east, and it eventually comes through southern Europe and Portugal and devastates all of northern Europe at this point. So the Black Death is incredibly important because it decimates feudal society. And part of the reason it decimates feudal society is, well, think what happens if 50% of the population is wiped out. Aside from just the horrible wanton destruction, there's also the fact of, well, what happens to agricultural production, right? If you've got a certain population of people producing barely enough food to feed the entire country, maybe some for export, and this is sort of the thing of feudalism, there was a lot of food production, agricultural production, but this is pre-capitalism, this is pre-commercial agriculture, which means they're often very rarely meeting the demands of their society. They can just barely feed the entire country at this point. And you have to remember, 85 to 90% of the population is working in agriculture. So it takes almost the entire population of a society just to produce enough food to feed itself. Now you can imagine what happens when half of that population is wiped out. All of a sudden, right, production at least falls off a cliff, right? You just don't have the amount of people to produce enough agriculture at this point. And so what does this lead to? So on the one hand, a lot of historians emphasize this as the prime mover, and they're certainly correct that the bubonic plague is absolutely essential in creating the crisis of late feudalism that will eventually lead to capitalism. But other things happen as a result of that. So one of the things that it does is, because 50% of the population is wiped out, it all of a sudden means that peasants and labor have a bit more power than they normally do, right? Because think of a modern labor market. Labor markets didn't exist in the modern sense as they do today because labor was not free back then. But if you are an employer and you walk out of your factory and you say, I have 5 jobs, and there's 1,000 people waiting to apply for those jobs, well, who has all the power? The employer does, because there's so many people that want the job. If you apply for it and you say, well, I expect to make X amount of dollars, and the employer says, well, no, we're not going to pay you that, and you say, well, that's what I'm going to work for, the employer simply say, well, okay, that's fine, but there's 4,000 other people that want your job. So if you won't work for what I'm offering, I'll go find one of them. Now, when the situation reverses itself, when all of a sudden labor is scarce, what happens? They have more power. If you have a system of wages, wages go up. So peasants at this point, it wasn't so much an increase in wages and payment, although that did happen. What it also did was help break sort of these feudal bonds, these things that kept serfs attached to the land or peasants attached to the land. All of a sudden, because labor was scarce, they could move around a bit more. They could go to landlords that would offer them more privileges, more money, a greater share of the crop, more freedom. And it essentially put peasants in the driver's seat. It gave them a lot more power. And of course, the state and sort of lords responded in the only way that they knew how, which was to sort of squeeze the peasants, right? Again, this is pre-capitalist, so nobody's thinking, nobody is really thinking, well, the way to actually produce more food is to try to research more sort of efficient methods of production, to try to increase our efficiency and therefore produce more with less. That's not how people thought. Or it's certainly not how lords thought in the 14th century. Their instinct was, well, we just have to get harsher. We have to squeeze the peasants a little bit more, right? So they tried to do this. And you got tremendous class conflict between peasants and lord. And again, this is where the Marxist historians, they place their emphasis on the prime mover, that it was actually out of this conflict between peasants and lords that the system started to further fall apart. And there is a lot of truth in that. Of course, the demographic historians can respond and say, well, yeah, but you wouldn't have got that situation without the demographic collapse of the Black Death, right? And the class conflict historians would respond and say, well, yes, but if you didn't get this sort of class conflict in the way that it happened, it would have stopped there, right? After all, I mean, the plague was nothing new. This was just sort of the worst case of it. So what happens then is, in an effort to squeeze the peasants, there's a lot of revolt. One of the things that happened, if we go back to the slide here, this is sort of in 1381 in East Anglia, in England, you get tax collectors that come in and actually try to tax the peasants even more. And you get a revolt where you get violence and rebellions and things are put down. So the system becomes unstable, largely because the relations of production have been thrown out of balance. That all of a sudden the people that are producing things at the ground level have a little bit more power than they did previously. Now, a lot of what happens then, another sort of feature of the crisis of late feudalism is the rise of towns and cities and merchant capital. And merchant capital becomes a little bit more prominent in this period. So as cities rise, you get a less emphasis on agricultural production. You get a more, towns and cities become more important. And I'm actually going to pause here for a minute. In the next video, it's actually an interview that Professor Halpern did with a professor in our department, Professor Andre Sorensen, who is a geographer who focuses on the role of towns and cities in the rise of capitalism. So I'm just going to pause there, watch that video. He's also going to talk about city studies at UTSC, a program if you're in first or second year that you might look into potentially majoring in or taking courses in. And then after that video, I'm going to make another video that looks at sort of what comes next of this crisis of feudalism. Okay, so we've got a demographic collapse. We've got tremendous class conflict. You have the peasants all of a sudden have a bit more freedom than they usually have. They can make more demands than they normally would. And so what we'll look at after Professor Sorensen talks about the rise of towns and cities is a lot of the consequences of this class conflict and how that also contributes to the rise of towns, cities, and then eventually to the sort of intensification of merchant capitalism. I'll leave it there.